Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. This 30-minute podcast features a new author interviewed by me every single day, 365 days a year, for about 30 minutes. I am also the publisher for Zibby Books, which publishes 12 books a year in fiction and memoir. Our books are already out now. You can check it out on zibbybooks.com. And we have a magazine called Zibby Mag, where we have lots of wonderful essays and lifestyle features. That's at zibbymag.com. We have classes at zibbyclasses.com. And I recently opened a bookstore in LA called Zibby's Bookshop at 1113 Montana Avenue at 11th Street in Santa Monica. I hope that you are able to enjoy some of our other offerings. But this here podcast is the basis of all of it and started in 2018. And no matter what I do, this is basically my favorite thing. Enjoy. Mona Simpson is the author of Commitment, a novel. Mona was born in Green Bay, Wisconsin, then moved to Los Angeles as a young teenager. Her father was a recent immigrant from Syria, and her mother was the daughter of a mink farmer and the first person in her family to attend college. Simpson went to Berkeley, where she studied poetry. She worked as a journalist before moving to New York to attend Columbia's MFA program. During graduate school, she published her first short stories in Plowshares, the Iowa Review, and Mademoiselle. She stayed in New York and worked as an editor at the Paris Review for 5 years while finishing her first novel, Anywhere But Here. After that, she wrote The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, and Casebook. Her work has been awarded several prizes: a Whiting Prize, a Guggenheim, a grant from the NEA, a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton University, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Prize, a Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize, Penn Faulkner finalist, and most recently a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She lives in Santa Monica with her 2 children and Bartleby the dog. Welcome, Mona. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss your latest novel, Commitment.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Would you mind telling listeners about your amazing new novel?
Oh, I'll try. It's funny. It's the most common question, but it's hard to answer,
Sure.
as you probably know.
Yes.
By the end of a book tour, I feel like I can easily describe the novel. But usually at about this point, which is the beginning, the middle of the beginning, I'm not so certain. It started in a number of ways. It's a book about 3 siblings who have a mother who is a bit fragile and a single mom who was a bit of a striver and, worked to get them in the best school district or in one of the good public school districts in Los Angeles in the 1970s. And then after she takes her oldest child to Berkeley, she falls into a real depression, which she can't seem to get out of. And eventually she's taken to a state mental health hospital. And her 2 kids who are remaining home and her son, who's a student at Berkeley, have to then put together their lives and try to help their mom and go from there, so to speak. So that's what it's about.
It's about giving so much and then, realizing you have nothing left to give. Sort of. I love all the Palisades references in the book and Pali High and all of the stuff. And even how you have, Walter get into Pali High because of a relationship with his mom, with someone in her exercise class whose address that she kind of stole. And I thought it was so interesting how you said, she could have turned them in. She could have easily have noticed all the mail, but
Right.
This is something that so many people, not so many, but many people were trying to do just to get a better education. And you talk about the mom's reverence for her nursing degree and how important education was for her. And all she wants to do is just give her kids a better life. So immediately we're drawn in and sort of rooting for her. And because what would we all not do for our kids?
Yeah, that's true. And it's also just a sad state of affairs that one has to do that or
Yes.
would have to do that because, there's been all the studies, as you well know, of the zip code of where you live really determining so much of your future socioeconomic outcome. So she thinks that she's probably right, that the school that her kids are districted for is not as good a school. But that's a very sad state of affairs, especially for those who grew up in public schools when they were a little better than they are now.
Yeah. And you immediately highlight the competition between moms, which so many people can relate to as well, when she's driving up to take Walter to school. And the other mom's like, "You're not going? Well, I wouldn't miss this for anything." And I'm like, oh, I could so see and hear that whole scene. I know that other mom, and she's just like, oh no, like bracing herself. And even how Walter was so perceptive and is like, my mom doesn't do, she didn't do well with women like that. They made her nervous, which of course, like women like that make everyone nervous.
How old are your children?
I have two 15-year-olds. They're almost 16, and then a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old. So
oh my goodness.
I know.
Wow. That's so nice.
It's fun, but yes, you come up against all types of parents. Talk about the decision to figure out what to do when the mom has this breakdown. There's so many ways you could have gone with the story, right? She could have just suffered at home. Like, why go to the institution? Why, or I guess I should back up and just say, which piece of this story came to you first? Like, what was really exciting to you about it?
I think one of the ways I really, with the novel that I worked on for this long, I had a couple of sort of little doors into it. And one of them was certainly Walter was starting with a kid who was in college and who had a lot of the usual experiences, sort of falling in love with the two girls down the hall, and especially one, and loving his roommate, and just exuberant with the feelings of friendship. But at the same time, as he's having these very sort of universal and typical experiences, he also has a whole other life going on in his head about his concern for what's going on at home. Mm-hmm. And then another way into the book I had is I read an essay by the late and wonderful writer Oliver Sacks called The Lost Virtues of the Asylum. And I, before that, I guess I'd grown up like most people in my generation. I'd seen Who Went Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I sort of thought of those big state institutions as snake pits and terrible places of abuse and exploitation. But this essay sort of traced the history of how those hospitals started in America and what the original ideals were. And he actually quoted a number of people who've been committed, and several of them actually had better lives in a smaller, more protected environment, and wrote about it in their memoirs. So while acknowledging, he himself worked at Bronx State, which was one of these hospitals for decades. So he had a certain kind of authority, and he wasn't glossing over anything. He said, of course, there were bad nurses. Of course, there were bad doctors. And of course, there were also very good ones. And, he had memories of all kinds, but he certainly remembered many patients leading peaceful and seemingly productive lives inside the institution. So I was also thinking about that, and I was thinking about how really we grew up, or at least I grew up, kind of in the age of institutions, and how many of them really have ceased to exist. I grew up in a town in the Midwest where there was one orphanage in the middle of town. Now we have foster care. We don't really have an orphanage. There are all kinds of ways in which we've changed the way we take care of society's neediest people. And I guess this was a little bit of I wanted to examine whether maybe we went too far in closing all the mental health hospitals, or in everything, most of them out. Now, 90% of the people who were there in 1960, the beds aren't there anymore.
Well, I feel like you see that particularly here in New York, the effect of not having proper, state-sanctioned mental health and what happens as a result of all of that.
Yeah.
I worked in a psychiatric institution for a summer, which I found really eye-opening, because in my head, I for a while I wanted to be a psychologist and all that. So in my head, I thought, oh, okay, well, when you get to a point where you really need to go to a hospital, right? Like they'll take care of you, and you'll really get the care you need. But when I was there, managing so many people with so many disparate mental health conditions, all in the same ward, basically. It became much more about management. And I was in the adolescent inpatient unit, but still it became about like rewards and systems and how to manage. And I'm like, well, this is not the like TLC I would imagine, where like you hit bottom and you need help, right? This is like the complete opposite. This isn't going to make anybody feel any better. Like, how is this going to help?
And that's kind of what happened everywhere. A large thing that happened with these big state institutions is when they opened, people brought their aged parents and left. So it was kind of the first form of institutionalized elder care in this country. And so, of course, these wards became incredibly overcrowded. The funding was less than they'd, of course, hoped or than it had been at the beginning. Of course, that's not going to work. These places were designed to have therapy, really, and to have a kind of peace and quiet and some time in nature and libraries and so forth, orchestras. And of course, with one or two doctors and hundreds of patients, none of that is possible.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, it's really powerful the way you write about it and for us to see it. Another great example, I feel like, and I don't know if you've read Wally Lamb's book, which was recently made into that miniseries, which was amazing.
No, but I saw it.
Wasn't that amazing?
Looks like it's going to be really great. Yeah, I have it in my queue.
Oh my gosh. Push it up the queue. Now I'm blanking on the name. I always forget the name. It was with Mark Ruffalo. But you will never think about institutions the same way after that either. So I don't know. I feel like there's a narrative about, it's prison literature, institution literature. Anyway, you also are really good, as you well know, I'm sure, but at observing the way that society works and all those sort of unspoken things. Like you had a line that said how the younger daughter analyzed something like she analyzed the way that the goddess girls at Pali High, how they operated, similar to how boys analyze sports moves, right? Like they had to study them. She had to know everything. Talk a little bit about that, because I feel like there's so much of this like societal commentary woven in.
I think that's always a good thing for the novel. I think that's what, in a way, what we go to fiction for, is those little irritations and those little hurts and those little things that we feel in everyday life get explained in a way in fiction. And especially with this family, because they're not quite members of this community in a way. They live outside of the district, as you said. Their mom got them in with a fake address, so they can't ever have people over to where they live. They can't even accept a ride home. If one of their friends is driving, they can't even get a ride home because they don't want to, blow their cover. Because of that, I think they're also especially vigilant in that way. I think they're all vigilant in the way one is when one doesn't easily, gracefully, casually belong.
The show was I Know This Much Is True. It just came to me, by the way. Okay, anyway. But you write really well about this feeling of being other, or being on the outside and trying so hard to get in. Like, where does that come from for you? And like, in what situations do you feel other?
That's a good question. I think probably, I grew up as the child of a single mom, and we lived in a small Midwestern town and then eventually moved to California. So I don't know. I don't think I was ever quite in the situation of these kids, but I certainly grew up poorer than most of my classmates. So I was aware of, that kind of feeling.
Interesting. And then how did you go from coming from the Midwest and your background or whatever, however you arrived in LA, to then, selling books, having your book in 1986 be made into a movie? I mean, that's like the American dream, right? So what happened in between? What happened in between 1986 and arriving in Hollywood? How did that all happen?
In 1986, I was living in New York, but
sorry.
The book sold to Hollywood, but it didn't get made, I don't think, until a few years later. But I went to UC Berkeley, and I had a situation a little bit like Walter's at Berkeley. I was a scholarship kid at Berkeley, and then I went to New York for graduate school to Columbia. And I guess when I went to Berkeley, I first thought, like you, I might want to be a psychiatrist, and then changed to writing. And I stayed, I guess, a few years after graduating and worked as a journalist, which was really fun. And I guess it's what it's what I always wanted to do most. And so I've sort of stuck at it, for better or worse.
What was it like having that book be successful and get option made, like the whole to do? And then, you've written how many novels? 6 novels now? 6, 7?
7.
7th novel, sorry. How do you keep sort of reinventing the form and figuring out what to do next and sort of keeping this going without being hindered by past successes?
Well, I think I've been lucky in a way in that regard. I mean, I don't think I'm that, I'm not that successful. So I wouldn't ever get that feeling of like, oh my God, I've made it. You know what I mean? I still feel sort of hungry. I still teach, for example. I've still got my teaching job. And so that hasn't been so much a problem. I think every time, you feel like it should get easier, but it doesn't necessarily. It's one of those fields in which every story seems to present its own problems and challenges. And this one was hard for me.
And you referenced earlier that this took you a while. How long did this take?
Yeah.
When did you start working on it?
Somebody asked me that, and I told this lovely reporter at the LA Times that it had taken 6 years. And then afterwards, I Googled it, and actually it was 9 years since my last book was published. So it way too long, although there were other things in there too. There was COVID and, the paper shortage. And my editor, whom I've been with for years and years and years, was working in the South. She'd gone back to Charleston, where she has relatives, and she wasn't with her assistant, and she's very computer dependent. So things went slower than usual, but nonetheless, it was a very, very long time. I don't encourage that. I don't think it's a good idea. One of the good things about that, though, is I did actually start a shorter book in the last few years of this book. And so I have another one almost ready.
Oh, smart.
Make up a little time.
Yeah, good. Tell me about that book.
That book is kind of 2 sections. It's called Help, and its sequel. And it's about, the problems of helping other people, of trying to help other people. It's about a young woman in New York, just out of graduate school, just trying to, make a living, just barely making a living, getting her first apartment. And at that time, her family back in the Midwest one of her cousins has been hospitalized because she's having terrible problems at home and she's not eating, and it's looking very bad for her. So they want to send her to New York to what they see as their successful, niece. But in fact, she's barely, she goes to the bank machine and takes out a $20 bill because that's really all she can take out because she's near the bottom of the balance. So it's about that girl coming to stay with her and trying to help her, but the limits of that. While at the same time, her landlord comes to her with his granddaughter, who's fairly privileged. She's seeing a private guidance counselor. They know that she's trying to be a journalist, so they say, "Will you help her write her college entrance essay?" So it's about who's able to be helped and who's not, why, and all the complexities of that.
Oh, that sounds really good. Exciting. Yeah, just keep it going, keep the machine churning. What do you like to do when you're not teaching and writing and all of that? I know you live in California. Do you hike? I feel like everybody who lives in Santa Monica hikes.
I hike. I see you have a dog. I have a wonderful dog. Where is he? Copperfield. Gosh, I don't know. I do the usual things. I suppose I take walks, I hike, I read, I go to the movies, have dinner parties, all that. It's funny that, the kids your age, I just was at a wedding, at a kind of a lovely, lovely wedding in Northern California with 5 of the families who my oldest child, my son, grew up with. And sort of his best friend from babyhood on was just getting married. So it was really lovely to see those families again.
Aww.
Yeah. That's
so nice. I have a group with my oldest son's lower school buddies. And because I feel like that group of moms in particular, we went through so much. Actually, even his preschool buddies, that's another group of friends. I don't know. I guess my twins put me through the ringer.
No, it's really true. It's a whole different group.
Yeah. There's something about, in the trenches with those families and especially at that young age, but it's kind of different than now. But who knows? And are you reading anything great?
I'm teaching My Antonia and To the Lighthouse, which were both published
Oh, wow.
within each other. So, and it's really delightful to be doing that. So I've been reading all this Cather material and all this Wolf material.
Oh, wow.
It's really funny too. I've been, here I am on book tour trying to sound halfway intelligent, talking about my book. And in the critical edition that I'm teaching my Antonia from, there are her early interviews when she was, trying to talk about the book. And she's so much more stilted in the interview than she was, writing the book. It's very funny.
So you've been in the publishing world for a long time. How do you see where we are today? And, was there anything better back in the day, or is it easier, harder to break out books, or, is there anything we can do? I feel like some days it feels really challenging.
I don't know. I think kind of for self-protective reasons, just so I can write, I don't follow it probably as attentively as say my character follows the social ups and downs of her high school. So I'm not sure. I think that certainly during COVID, everybody was reading a lot. I hear a lot about young people not reading, but I don't know if I fully buy it, because I teach college students and I like to teach a big novel sometimes, like I've taught Middlemarch several times. I've taught Copperfield. I want to teach Great Expectations. I like to teach a big novel that takes the whole term to do. And that's all we do. We just do that novel. So we're reading at a reasonable pace. We're not reading hundreds of pages. I go down the halls and I see, some people will have Middlemarch covered in 2 weeks in their class. And I think, what can you possibly do in 2 weeks? So I often get, students from all over campus will take these classes. And sometimes it's the first real 19th century demanding long novel a lot of these students will have read. And it's absolutely an exhilarating experience for them. So I'm not sure I buy, but on the other hand, we are all on our phones, and that's true too. So I don't know what the future will be of books and literature. I just don't know. I think it probably helps that there are certainly good aspects of it all. I mean, I have my writing students do a little research on literary magazines, and also including online magazines. And each time they do it, it's kind of fun for me too, because they'll come up with a few new online magazines, which are really good. And, if you love this kind of thing, they should be going out in their 20s and starting some magazines and starting some podcasts and, starting some book clubs online, starting more public communal reading experiences.
Totally agree. Yes, that would be helpful to everyone involved. What is your process when you're writing a novel? Do you have where's your favorite place to write? And do you do it by hand, or you type, or what does that look like?
I used to write everything by hand, and now I sort of do the opposite. Now I still write sections in hand, but then I type them into the computer. And now I do a lot of revising by hand. I'll print the thing out and I'll revise it. In terms of a place to write, no, I moved back. I do have a little office at UCLA, but that's a ways from home. And I used to have a little office. I rented an office in Santa Monica, which I'm now subletting because I moved home when my kids were in high school, because I had plenty of time at home when they weren't here. But now I sort of roam around the house. So often I'm, working at the kitchen table because I just live with one other person. It's quite quiet.
Do you have a favorite food? I have no idea why I'm asking this. I'm just curious.
Well, I live in California, so the produce here is so good. So I probably have seasonal favorite foods. But it's funny, there's Santa Monica has wonderful farmers markets. So it's a great place to shop, because I go with one of my neighbors down the street who he carries a huge wagon. He's Italian and he's a fabulous cook. I sort of trail along and put things in his wagon. But there's a kind of berry that we all get here called Harry's berries, which I saw was in New York just last week.
They do not taste as good here. It's totally different. I was so excited, and I'm like, this does not taste the same at all.
Really?
They should just, I don't know. Maybe it's just like eating food closer to where it grows is just so much better.
It's much better.
Yeah.
I'm a true Californian. I have a vegetable garden and everything.
Oh, I was voting citrus for you. I was seeing oranges. I don't know, grapefruits. Anyway, I don't know. I'm crazy. I don't know why I'm talking about this. Anyway, congratulations on commitment.
Thank you so much.
It was really fun chatting, getting to know you. And I'm really excited for your event at Zibby's Bookshop coming up with Amy Efron. That'll be lovely. And thank you for all your time this morning.
Thank you. It's so nice. So nice getting a chance to talk to you.
You too. All right. Thanks so much, Mona.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.